moderation by Amy Ecoits, Senior Scientist and Team Leader Sustainable Landscape and Food System at CIFOR-ICRAF. Next, we will have introduction by Jody Harris, Food System Lead World Pact High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security Nutrition, or FSN, and EQ Team 2023. We will have quick poll session by Beta Luciana, Senior Ecological Modeler at CIFOR-ICRAF and ICT. After that, EQT and FSN in multiple countries by Mulia Nur Hassan, Scientist at CIFOR-ICRAF. Equity Consideration in Zambia by Stepa Macmillan, Scientist at CIFOR-ICRAF. Equity in the Land for Life Project Indonesia by Doni Indiarto. Next, Metrics for Measuring Agency by Mary, and then Experience from Ghana and India by Gloria Adeyigya and Swati Renduchintala. And the last but not least, Question or Discussion by Amy Ecoits and Elise Kranja. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the CIFOR-ICRAF Science Week 2023. With this year theme is Equity in Action, providing a unique opportunity to learn about CIFOR-ICRAF commitment to equity and inclusion, and how its work addressed to the global challenge and equity in all its work with and for communities, partners, and governments. My name is Sinta Silviana, a research consultant at CIFOR-ICRAF, feeling honored to be your master of ceremony today. Respected speaker, session leads, and audience, welcome to CIFOR-ICRAF Science Week 2023, Day 4, Considering Equity and Measuring Agency and for Food and Nutrition Security. Before we start the first agenda, I would like to inform that for all attendees in the Zoom, if you have any question, kindly use the raise hand reaction and the moderator will accommodate your question. Without further ado, please welcome Amy Ecoits, Senior Scientist and Team Leader Sustainable Landscapes and Food System to present introduction and moderator in this session. Time's about 90 minutes. Pass areas over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much. This session is a merger of two initial sessions, one on equity and one on agency. And I would like to thank the Science Week Committee for asking us to actually join our sessions, because I think both topics really inform each other very well. We have many presentations, as you saw, so we're going to be very strict about sticking to time. And we're going to, as the MC said, we're going to take questions at the end. So first, I have the great pleasure of introducing Jody Harris, who is the Global Food Systems Lead Researcher at the World Vegetable Center. Jody has long worked in the field of politics and ethics of food systems. And she's the co-author of this year's high-level panel of expert report on reducing inequality in food systems. And she's also the co-coordinator of the Food Equality Center. So thank you, Jody, and thank you so much. Also, Jody just came back this morning from leave and very generously and graciously offered to give us our keynote. So please give her a hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be with you all today and really excited that your organizations are focusing so clearly on equity and equality. It's something we all need to do more in our organizations. And so, yeah, I was really happy to give my contribution today. So let me know if you can't see my slides, but should be able to by now.
All good.
All good. Thanks, Fabio. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about some work I've done with colleagues at the Institute of Development Studies, at the Food Equity Center, and through the HLPE program, thinking about how we research equity and equality. So I should say up front, my focus in our sort of field is nutrition, but often from a food and agriculture angle. So some of what I'll present is about nutrition and some on broader food systems issues, but I think the sort of concepts and topics are going to be relevant to the various things that our organizations do. Okay, so if you can only stay for 5 minutes before you leave, here's my main point. So classically, it's the most marginalized groups in a given society who are most malnourished, or if we're looking at other outcomes, who have the worst dietary outcomes or worst livelihood outcomes, or whatever you choose to measure. So the idea is that we need to acknowledge this and understand who is marginalized and why and how in order to sustainably address those issues. So for nutrition, that pattern plays out in most locations and for a variety of axes of marginalization. So on the slide, just examples of maternal education leading to malnutrition in India, lower maternal education, lower wealth in Botswana, or rural location in Honduras, just as examples. So we know these issues underpin malnutrition. We have the disaggregated outcome data in some cases, but these issues have been frustratingly under-researched and even under-theorized in nutrition or in the agriculture nutrition field. So I know you've already had half a week on these issues, but I'll just start with some concepts and definitions. So marginalization, in the way that we think about it, is the key concept that underpins inequality and inequity. And it can be defined as the treatment of a person or a group or a concept as insignificant or peripheral. So we know that a lot of nutrition or agriculture nutrition research concerns itself with aspects of marginalization. So for instance, I'm sure you'll recognize a lot of work looks at the disempowerment of women, for instance, or disparities in income, both pretty common in our research. But other axes of marginalization, things like age, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, geographic location, seem to come up a lot less often in the literature when we're looking at who has those different food security and nutrition outcomes. And the interactions between those different aspects of marginalization, what we call intersectionality, come up even less often. And then the structural determinants of marginalization, inequitable access to basic services and resources and political redressal and power relations and social norms, are also underexplored usually in our field. So there are different layers to this concept, from looking at unequal outcomes, food security and nutrition outcomes, for instance, to looking at these inequitable processes that lead to those outcomes. So what we tried to do a few years ago is capture those layers in the nutrition equity framework, which draws on lots of existing social theory and brings it together for the context of nutrition. So we argue that we need to understand what drives these observed inequalities in outcomes, in our case, nutrition outcomes, to sustainably address their basic determinants with an equity lens. So the easiest factors to see and to measure and maybe to understand are people's experience of their immediate food, health and care environments, which are conditioned by people's own daily living conditions and their behavioral choices, of course. And those issues are fairly commonly discussed or researched. And then underlying opportunities to achieve those things are people's social position in terms of things like we were just talking about, gender, caste, or other identities that condition marginalization or inclusion, and the personal or group resources that people have to draw on in any given context, and which often accrue over multiple lifetimes, so their human capital and potential. And then underpinning those, the most structural determinants of who is marginalized and therefore who most often ends up malnourished is a combination of the cultural ideas, norms and values in a given society which shaped who is placed higher or lower in a social hierarchy. So for instance, how women are viewed or how different ethnicities are treated. And then how those crystallize into governance of those societies through institutions and rules and structures. And then the multiple interactions which occur between social position, human capital, and those social and political environments are driven by what we've called in the framework an engine of inequity. So it's made up of injustice, unfairness, and exclusion, and it describes how cycles of marginalization and discrimination occur. So we've been thinking about what these issues mean for nutrition, and this framework starts to give us a kind of logic of what we need to understand and what we need to then address if we recognize that these deep issues on the left of the framework have a direct conceptual link to those food security and nutrition outcomes on the right-hand side. So it gives us a way of thinking about this, I guess. So if we wanted to look only at inequality, the things on the right-hand side of the framework, we would go this far. We would say, hey, the kids of less educated mothers have poorer nutrition outcomes in India. We need to educate mothers. Or, hey, the kids of poorer families have poorer nutrition outcomes in Botswana. We need to ensure decent work or social protection to families. Or, hey, rural kids have poorer nutrition outcomes than urban kids in Honduras. We need to focus on rural areas. And it's great, it's really important to look at disaggregated outcomes like this. But we argue that it's not enough in terms of deciding what to do to then fix the issue. So it's a first step, I guess, in research and also in action. So we tried to go further to look at inequity in our work, some of the stuff on the left-hand side of the framework. So I'm going to quickly just give an example of a mixed methods study of historical factors affecting stunting reduction in Vietnam, just to give a sense of the ways that we've started to try to address this. It's not easy to address in research. So our starting place was these disaggregated outcomes. It was that Vietnam has achieved significant progress in reducing undernutrition over the past several decades, really. And it's held up as a regional example of what can be accomplished through sustained commitment to coherent policy across economic and social development and a focus on nutrition specifically as well. But those national figures, those national reductions in stunting, mask significant inequalities in outcomes. So if you dig a bit deeper in Vietnam, the poorest households with the most malnutrition tend to be ethnic minority households. So of the 10% of the population still living below the poverty line in Vietnam, 65% belong to one of Vietnam's 53 ethnic minority groups. So ethnic minorities, and in particular the smaller ethnic groups in the central and northern highland regions, have fallen behind in Vietnam's sort of rush to middle income status, and a large proportion of the remaining burden of undernutrition falls in those ethnic minority communities. And so that's an equity issue, clearly, and an injustice, but it's also slowing Vietnam's overall rate of undernutrition reduction, which is something that the country might want to address. So going kind of a step back in the framework, so many of the factors found to be drivers of stunting reduction in the overall population are still lagging far behind for ethnic minority groups. So in these charts, I don't know if you can see them well, but the orange dots are the ethnic minority groups combined, and the green dots are the kin majority ethnicity. And what you can see here basically is that wealth, health, and education, which are three of the major drivers of stunting reduction in our decomposition analysis that we did in this paper, are lagging behind for ethnic minority groups overall. So patterns of inequity are mirrored when looking at the underlying determinants of nutrition, where ethnic minorities have consistently worse socioeconomic situation and access to infrastructure and services. So trying to go sort of towards the left-hand side of the framework, we also looked at the policy environment and also how policy making was done. And obviously there's a lot more detail in the paper, but we found that in order to tackle remaining pockets of high malnutrition, more attention to the structural barriers that are hindering ethnic minority communities and incorporation of their own proposed solutions will be needed. So alongside kind of renewed technical policies, it will need things like prioritized nutrition funding and capacity for provinces with high minority populations. And the current national development discourse aims to incorporate minorities into mainstream majority systems. And from an equity angle, this paper argues that instead, policy should recognize that minority groups have particular needs and also particular preferences of ways to tackle those identified drivers of malnutrition. And minority communities really need to be represented in framing their own solutions in the policy process based on their own community barriers and priorities. So that was our attempt to try and kind of look at the full framework. It's a difficult thing to do, but there's an example there of how it might be done. So there are different types of research needed to understand different aspects of equality and equity. And a few years back, we did a scoping review to understand the range of literature out there on those topics in our field, in the agriculture, nutrition and health field. So this is the sort of final figure of that paper, and it brings the research together and shows the density of research covering the different equity topics on the left-hand side there within each of the agriculture, nutrition and health fields in the literature. And what this shows essentially is that while there is sort of some nuance within the different agriculture, nutrition and health topics, there were most papers looking at those unequal outcomes, so at inequality of outcomes based on social positions, such as through gender, so the sort of right-hand side of the framework. Then the next most set of papers looked at the material circumstances of people, so resources and assets, or physical and human and other capital available to people. And then the fewest papers looked at those structural determinants of inequity, things like social norms and values, or broader social and political exclusion. So in summary, most papers looked at what the inequality problem is, fewer looked at how this inequity is shaped, and fewer still looked at sort of why the inequity exists in the first place. And people researching agriculture, nutrition and health often focus towards that right-hand side of the nutrition equity framework, rather than on those deeper drivers, for all sorts of reasons. It's sort of easier to get to, it depends on our disciplinary training. Perhaps we can discuss more in the session, sort of the reasons why that might be. But the review sort of showed that fairly clearly, I think. So going beyond just nutrition, I just wanted to include a couple of slides from the forthcoming HLPE report. I don't know if you're all familiar with those reports from the UN Committee on Food Security, but the next one will be on inequality and inequity and will be launched about 1 month from now. So please take anything I say now as draft, because I'm sure there will be some final tweaks. But in this report, essentially, we were asked to broaden from nutrition focus to a food security and nutrition focus, and with a food systems lens, so perhaps more relevant to the kinds of work we're all doing nowadays in food systems. So similarly to the nutrition equity framework that I showed before, this report defines inequalities as the sort of right-hand side, the differences in these food security and nutrition outcomes between individuals and groups when disaggregated by social, economic or other positions, and then defines the underlying inequities as the eminently avoidable reasons for why that uneven distribution exists and why disadvantage accrues systematically based on that social position and intersectional discrimination. So it takes a very similar position to what I was describing earlier. So this is the conceptual framework from the report. The framework, again, is fairly similar to the nutrition equity framework in that it acknowledges both unequal outcomes and the inequitable drivers of those. And it has a similar engine driving it, that sort of circle in the middle. So while in the nutrition equity framework, it was unfairness, exclusion, and injustice, here it's three things. It's recognition that marginalization exists, its representation of marginalized groups, and its redistribution of resources or opportunities to those groups. So it's just a slight reframing, slightly different language, but similar issues. And so this HLPE framework takes a sort of positive focus. It takes a what can be done focus rather than a how has these issues come about focus. So the conceptual framework describes inequalities in food security and nutrition outcomes as best addressed by addressing inequalities in food and other systems, and most sustainably addressed by understanding marginalization in context and then using this engine of equity to achieve redistribution, recognition, and representation for marginalized groups. And so the report has 4 major groups of recommendations at the end. So we say address social and political equity drivers, those deeper drivers on the left, address inequalities within food systems, address inequalities in other associated systems, because we know especially for nutrition, it's not everything comes from the food system. And then we've included a recommendation on using inclusive knowledges, so the different ways that different marginalized groups understand the issue, and equity sensitive data. So those recommendation areas are split into 10 action areas, and then there are several specific recommendations for each, which I haven't shown here. And critically, in those sort of blue and green boxes at the end, we've tried to show which actions address which aspects of inequity, the recognition, representation, or redistribution. And likely the most effective solutions are those that cut across all three aspects. And the report also has a set of principles. I think you're probably the first people to see these, through which those recommendations should be applied in different contexts. So a way of thinking through which groups are marginalized and why and how in different places, and therefore how these recommendations can be fit to context. And so lastly, my last slide, a little bit on what all that adds up to. Agency has been defined in these HLPE reports as what a person is free to do and achieve in pursuit of whatever goals or values he or she regards as important. And I would say agency for different groups is what we're all ultimately trying to achieve in pursuit of context-specific solutions to poor food security and nutrition. So agency is kind of the result of these frameworks, of what we're going to do to address these frameworks. And then empowerment is an important aspect of agency, so that people have the ability to participate and engage in society and contribute to shaping and bettering their own lives and well-being. And I know we're going to have a session in a minute on measuring agency, so I won't go into that, but I'll just point out that there are different levels at which projects or programs or policies can hope to intervene. And this was laid out by Agnes Kissenbing at IFPRI and others for gender. But I would say these ideas are equally applicable to other marginalized groups, not only women, but depending on context, all of those other aspects of marginalization that we talked about earlier. So you can focus on reaching marginalized groups with your project or your policy, or you can go a step further and try to benefit them, even if not through their preferred solutions. Or you can go a step further and work on empowering them to input into their own life choices. So that's getting closer to agency. And ultimately by transforming those sort of fundamental socio-political systems that shape how people are able to engage with their world. And obviously the earlier ideas at the top of the slide are easier to both achieve and measure. And the later ones take some time, sometimes even generations, and usually can't be quantified as easily, though approaches such as the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index do give it a good try. So I'd say this is what those frameworks are trying to explain, why inequality and inequity come about, or what we could do to address them. And I would say that this is what we're trying to sort of achieve at the end of the day. So that's just a brief introduction to equality, equity, and agency in food security and nutrition, with a couple of examples and a couple of frameworks which draw on established social theory, but then try and bring it into our field. And I'd say the field of nutrition is a little bit behind others, like behind agriculture or behind health in thinking about these ideas. So it's certainly timely that we're doing this. So I hope that those ideas prove useful in this session. And I very much look forward to discussing in the context of your organization in the rest of the session. So back to you, Amy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jody, for that excellent introduction to actually both topics for today, and for giving us a sneak preview into the new HLPE. So yes, I'm happy if you can hang around for the question period at the end, and to also give us maybe some feedback on the work that we're doing and how you see it potentially ties in, and maybe ways that we can strengthen our work in this area. So thanks so much. And over to Beta Luciana now, who's going to be running a poll.
Okay, thank you. So just to have a few, a quick poll regarding maybe reflecting on what Jody presented to us. So can you please show the poll? Slido time again? I guess we're using Slido again. Okay. So bring out your handphone. And so the first question is, have you noticed inequity related to food security in nutrition in your current or past work? That is the first questions. Okay. So whether it's a simple yes or no. And I think we're going to just have 2 questions because to make sure that we have the time. Yes, please. Can you show the result? Okay, so a lot of yes. Now the next questions. The next question is, only 30 people.
You need to allow time for people to reply.
Okay. So how many now? 41, 56 online, and I think quite a few people here. 30. But we cannot assume that it will be consistent. So those who answer are those who see it, I guess. Who don't see it. Okay, 60.
I think the trend is clear.
Okay, so let's go to the next questions. So can you give some keywords, but then separately, I guess, yeah, don't put it in one answers to describe what the inequity is about. Okay. Oh, patriarchy. 1 person. Okay, let's wait until 60. There was 60 response before. Okay, culture, that's a big one. Access, opportunity, portion. Okay, inequity in terms of portion. Okay. So it's culture, access, opportunity. Wow. Okay. We can stop now? Yeah. Thank you very much. So that's a quick poll, and hopefully the next 3 presentation can provide you further about these issues. Thank you. For the next presentation.
Yeah, Amy said this is a presentation for people who should self-introduce themselves. So, first thing first, happy birthday, Fergus. And Martin and my son, who is not here. And secondly, I want to show a presentation which I make with 4 of my nutritionist colleagues who are Ichal, Ama, Nia, and Desi. If you could please stand up. They are nutritionists and registered nutritionists. There I say they are the only 4 registered nutritionists in the whole country with skill and expertise in analyzing data from food from the forest, nutrition and trees related nutrition. So there's no other nutritionist but them. So completely an asset for CIFOR-ICRAF. Can we have the light? Can maybe Nairobi also turn off the light, please? For the presentation, okay. Yes. Please start.
Nama saya Bani, tinggal di kampung Sungai T. Alam Sungai Market kami. Karena di situ cukup. Apa aja yang mau diambil itu di situ. Ubatan di situ, sayuran di situ. Kemarin kita sore itu makan malam kita dengan pakai siap mirah kan. Pagi ini udah daun singkong. Siang nanti mungkin ini. Begitu. Harus gini ini giliran. Kalau udah nggak ada, di mana kita dapat giliran makanan? Paksa beli.
Forests make up around 30% of the world land area and are the home to roughly 1.7 billion people, such as Bandi, who rely on them for food security and nutrition. Forests and trees contribute to food security and nutrition by providing food and energy, generating income and employment, and providing essential ecosystem services for food security and nutrition. Trees offer a diverse range of nutrient-rich food, including fruits, nuts, and wild meat. All nuts and over half of all cultivated fruits consumed by humans grow on trees. The direct provision of wild foods by forests has been proven to significantly enhance dietary adequacy in multiple locations. A study found that in tropical countries, food sourced from trees are 4 times higher in vitamin C and 9 times richer in vitamin A than other consumed food. Moreover, tree covers has been associated with greater dietary diversity and higher consumption of fruits and vegetables. Approximately 2.4 billion people lack access to affordable alternative energy sources and rely on trees and forests as source of wood fuel, such as firewood and charcoal. The use of wood fuel enables people to cook nutrient-rich foods such as meats and legumes, which they would have to forego otherwise. Despite the fact that many of these foods are available for purchase in modern market, including for you and me, the 1.7 billion people whose life depend on forests often lack this privilege. Losing access to forests, even when replaced by their income source, such as working in a plantation, does not always lead to better food security and nutrition for forest communities. In fact, decreasing access to forests is often associated with higher consumption of ultra-processed food sourced away from their land, and lower consumption of green leafy vegetable, fish, and wild meat. Development practices frequently sacrifice the traditional way of life of forest communities to generate income growth through intensive exploitation of natural resources focused on profit generation. This marginalizes the voices of forest communities. The decline in forest cover and loss of biodiversity due to development practices can lead to food insecurity and malnutrition for the forest communities, exacerbating existing inequalities. While forest communities may gain income through deforestation, they can also lose from a food security and nutrition perspective, particularly when agency and sustainability are considered as part of food security and nutrition. It is essential to prioritize the voices of marginalized communities in decision-making process and ensure that development initiatives do not harm their food security and nutrition. To achieve this, we must recognize the pivotal role that forests play in food security and nutrition, and pursue sustainable forest management practices that consider the nutritional benefit of forests and trees. However, forests and trees are often not recognized for their food and nutrition benefits by policymakers, donors, and even among scientists. This lack of recognition hinders the generation of evidence and limits research uptake by policymakers. As I stand before the esteemed group of forest and agroforestry experts, I implore you to join me in a critical question. How can we gain the recognition that forests and trees deserve in our food system? And despite these challenges, how can we work towards a fair and equitable system that ensure access to sufficient food and nutrition for all, including marginalized forest communities? Thank you.
Steph, are you there?
I am. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Can I have my slides, please? I think this is a hard act to follow with Jodi's wonderful introduction and Mulia's beautiful presentation. Okay, so good morning again, and good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here this morning to be able to present some of our work from a project in Zambia, which is looking at agroforestry and diversification for food and nutrition. Next slide. So I do need to give a bit of a background and context to some challenges in Zambia. So there's a high burden of malnutrition, with over half of the population undernourished and a third of children stunted, which is shortness for age and an indicator of chronic malnutrition, and also high rates of multiple micronutrient deficiencies. There's generally quite low production diversity and an over-reliance on maize, and this has implications for low dietary diversity and also micronutrients that are missing in these local food production systems. And often smallholder farmers are not well connected to markets as producers and sellers of produce, but also consumers. However, when we look at food and agriculture, there are emerging opportunities. Increasingly, there's regional and national recognition for diversifying food production to improve nutrition and also to enhance adaptive capacity. And trees and agroforestry systems are very much part of this diversification approach, because as Mulia described, trees are very important for providing food and nutrition directly into these local systems. Next slide. So the overall goal of the project was to increase year-round production and consumption of more nutritious foods with smallholder farmers in different sites across Zambia. And the objective was to adapt and expand the food tree portfolio approach into the Southern Africa region. Now, the food tree portfolios are a location-specific diversification strategy with very clear food and nutrition objectives. Next slide. So this is what a food tree portfolio looks like. It's customized to a specific location, in this case, Chibale in Central Province in Zambia. And these portfolios are essentially all about promoting greater diversity of not only food tree species, but also annual crops in local food production systems to address seasonal availability, but also micronutrients in staple-based systems. The portfolios themselves are combinations of indigenous and exotic species, both from cultivated and wild sources. And the overall objective is really to address seasonal availability so that there are different types of food available throughout the year. An important part of the portfolio is really delivering back key micronutrients into systems which are missing. And in staple-based systems, these are often vitamins A, C, iron, folate, and zinc. Next slide, please. And so, like I said, these are site-specific recommendations. And so we do need to capture information from different landscapes and communities when we develop them. And essentially, it's about considering the right tree and crop for the right place and the purpose. And there's three main components that we look at. And this bridges the ecological and social dimensions that we work in. So the first one is production diversity. And this is really considering the extent of species diversity and ecological suitability in a site. We need to understand seasonality and phenology as it relates to food trees, and also considering the nutritional value of the foods they provide. Second component is about consumption diversity, and this is where we need to understand local diets. It's important to understand what people are consuming, but what might actually be missing from their diets in terms of food and micronutrients. And within this component, we also consider food security and the sourcing of food, because we know that smallholder farmers don't only rely on food that's produced on farm, but they also access markets and use wild food. In a third component, it's all about priority setting with communities. This is where we use the information from production and consumption diversity to really sit and engage with communities around the priorities they have for diversification, for species, for addressing their food and nutritional needs. A new aspect that we've added to the portfolios is that of aspirations. And this is really looking at smallholder farmers' broader life and livelihood goals. Next slide, please. So I don't have much time to go into data from the project, but I did want to highlight the types of data that we capture and why it's important when we're considering equity as we customize these different diversification portfolios. So in terms of production and consumption diversity, it's really important to understand what smallholder farmers are producing and consuming and how this actually differs across different farms and different communities. It's also necessary to understand who's managing food production and who's making decisions within households and communities about practices and resources that allow food production. And this type of information helps us to make the right selection about a diversity of species that can fill these production and consumption gaps. Next slide, please. An important element of the portfolios in Zambia has been wild foods because they're widely used in Zambia. 76% of our households collect wild foods on a regular basis, and this happens between the most food insecure months, September and March. So understanding what types of food and species are collected from the wild, when they're collected from the wild, who's involved in that collection, and then how is that food used, whether it's for household consumption or markets, is really important to make sure that we incorporate wild foods into the portfolios because it adds an additional layer of resilience to the portfolios. Next slide, please. So in this step or this component of devising these portfolios, it's when we engage with the communities in priority setting and validating the portfolios based on the species diversity. This process is all about empowering communities by using their own knowledge. It's centered around their participation. It's based on their social values and diets, how they manage and use different resources, their different preferences for species, and also decision-making not only within households, but also within communities. And during this process, we usually have this priority setting exercise with different groups within the communities. So not only based on gender, men and women, and understanding their priorities and preferences, but also considering youth and older members of the communities in terms of what they want to see in the portfolios. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have a new dimension to the portfolios, and this is looking at aspirations. And this is really about considering smallholder farmers' broader goals, priorities, and needs for their livelihoods. So in terms of looking at this, we were able to identify certain typologies of farmers from low, medium, and high resilience in terms of how they cope with different shocks and the response time and the impact of those shocks based on their livelihood strategies. And we're able to match these typologies with aspirations to see whether they have high, medium, or low aspirations. And generally those who have higher aspirations, which is this broader view and desire for general life improvement, have a higher potential to want to adopt different practices or to diversify in the case of the portfolios. So understanding these smallholder farmer aspirations not only allows us to refine the portfolios in terms of their composition, but also then to think about strategies of how we will engage with smallholders to actually deliver technical information to them in the way that's going to make sense. Next slide, please. And so just to summarize, the portfolio approach is really about responding directly to community priorities. We layer ecological and social dimensions to be able to customize these site-specific portfolios. And as I mentioned in my first few slides, it's really about promoting greater diversity of species back into local food production systems. We want to enhance seasonal food resilience and bring greater diversity of diets locally. The portfolios are refined and validated based on smallholder aspirations, but also broader community priorities. And we use this information to actually then deliver portfolios and to engage with smallholder farmers So we use the information to be able to tailor the different communication, messaging, and training to ensure better uptake of the approaches that we're promoting. So far in Zambia, we've devised 8 location-specific food tree portfolios, but more broadly, yeah, I'm finished now, Amy. But more broadly, we have 30 across 6 countries in East and West Africa, and also expanding the approach to Brazil and India. Next slide, please. Just to say thank you, please visit our project webpage, and just to recognize that we have multiple collaborators that allow us to do this work in Zambia. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Doni? Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Doni, and I'm a researcher here at CIFOR-ICRAF Indonesia. And I'm honored here to share with you our ongoing work. And I want to emphasize that this talk was made possible by the hard work of our colleagues at CIFOR-ICRAF Indonesia. I'll start from the key findings from our previous work. Certain regions, given appropriate technology, possess the biophysical potential to yield long-term productivity. But managing social and environmental risks in these areas is equally crucial. Rapid agricultural expansion, often driven by large-scale land concessions, poses a significant social risk, as it can limit farmers to access fertile land. Additionally, regions with high environmental risks often grapple with severe issues like deforestation or frequent fires. Interestingly, Indonesia's lowland areas across the archipelago serve as the nation's food basket. However, only about half of it, or roughly 15.3 million hectares of these lowlands, are truly suitable for sustainable cultivation and management of select crops and commodities. So we are faced with the critical necessity to integrate food and land use planning. Our land resources are finite, and we need to balance economic growth, food production, and environmental preservation. The interconnectivity of sustainable development goals means achieving one could hinder others if not considered. Take, for example, the link between zero hunger and climate action. And then also we learn from past experiences. Non-integrative and uninformed land use planning could lead to conflicts. And additionally, the high diversity across rural areas in nature, human infrastructure, social and financial resources highlights the need for varied solutions and spatial connections. Indeed, in places like Indonesia, we often see food and land use systems governed in silos, even though they are tightly interlinked. So the UN Decade of Family Farming and the resulting National Action Plan may offer a timely opportunity. These global and national initiatives could be the vessel of our efforts to weave food systems into land use planning, particularly at provincial or district level. The development of these action plans should be inclusive, involving various stakeholders, and using technical processes like spatial analysis, modeling, to create action plan and scenarios. The process should offer scenarios that provide an alternative to the business as usual approach. So to navigate these complex linkages within food, land, and land use system, we require a framework that pictures the key component of the systems, outlines existing regulations for each component, and identifies where policy interventions may be necessary. This framework illustrates how agri-food policy in the red box predominantly cover land allocation and access through planning units and manage the 5 rural livelihoods capitals. These aspects directly shape our land use and farming systems. At the heart of the framework, at the center, land use and farming systems hold pivotal role. The local economy is closely linked with land use. On the other side, land use and farming systems facilitate food availability, affordability, and its resilience and sustainability aspects, such as agrobiodiversity. So there is an urgent need for geospatial analysis to inform zoning for fruit producing regions, identify cultivation options, and assess enabling factors such as infrastructure. This analysis must also spatially and quantitatively compare the benefits and impacts of various food and land use development scenarios. So I will present a case study from Banyuasin district in South Sumatra, which is slightly smaller than Northern Island in size and has a population of 843,000 with agriculture, forestry, fishing, and are the main contributors of its economy. The district is known for producing rubber, oil palm, coconut, and coffee. Please note that the following results are preliminary. So here I present typologies from geospatial analysis in addressing key questions in food production and land use. We could ask, we could ask where in the region are lands suitable for current farming system? Can limiting factors be addressed? For instance, the areas in gray indicate lands that are biophysically unsuitable for farming. Overcoming the limiting factors in these areas could be too costly, if not altogether unfeasible. We could also ask where is land available for smallholder farmers, and thus demand for land align with the supply. Finally, we must consider how existing farmland aligns with land allocation. Could it pose an environmental threat or risk on high risk disaster area? So the map on the right side, you see the areas in red color sit on peatland and a national park. So while the previous slide addressed queries or questions on food production, these maps respond to questions about food distribution, accessibility, and utilization. We could ask, are existing farming areas serviced by distribution infrastructure like roads? Are there accessible processing facilities nearby for farmers? These inquiries demand data, transport networks, data on transport networks, land cover, agricultural produce statistics, and processing facility locations. We also need to identify the populations most vulnerable to food insecurity. Currently, we are using the FSVA index as a proxy, but we are open to suggestions and ideas for better measures on this front. The guiding principles and criteria and macro indicators in this exercise are decided collaboratively. Displayed here is an early shortlist of the potential indicators. We welcome your thoughts. Is this comprehensive? What could be refined? So this concludes my presentation. As we navigate the complexities of food and land use systems, the need for an integrated and collaborative approach becomes increasingly clear. Thank you. Sorry, but
So we're going to have the next call, the second call before the next presentation. Presentation related to what we show the first question. So, do you have the question? Yeah, so, do you know what agency? Maybe you heard it.
Fabio, we can't hear you in the room here.
Okay, can you hear me
Okay,
now?
now yes, yes.
So, do you know what agency is? This is a simple yes or no. Don't lie. Okay. Oh, that's good. A lot of people know.
Next question.
Okay. Okay. So those who knows 45, Increasing or not? We need 60. We need 60. Hurry up.
Yes, you want it.
Oh, 53. Where are the rest? Okay. Oh, the more people join in, the more people don't know. Okay. So now, those who knows, do you address agency in your work? What was it before? 58? Almost 60, yeah? Oh, 61, okay. Well, it's 35. It's half of the people that answered. Okay. Oh, wow. That's philosophical question, is it? We think we do. Okay. 50-50 now. So probably those who say no are those who don't know what agency is. Now, this is the aspirational one, Anya. Do you think that it is important that CIFOR-ICRAF address agency in our work? Answer honestly. Okay, we need the next one, the next questions. Okay, good. It's good news, yeah, Mary? It's good news. Okay. Do we still have more questions?
No, let's not.
Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much for your participation.
All right. Hi, everyone. So my name's Mary Crossland. I'm an associate scientist at CIFOR-ICRAF. And what I'm going to do today is introduce the concept of agency for some of you that maybe aren't so aware of what it means, and also highlight some of the challenges that we need to be aware of when we're measuring and monitoring changes in agency, and in particular, women's agency. Okay, next slide. Great. And so maybe what we could have also asked is, what does agency mean to you? There's a lot of different interpretations of what agency means, but in general and relation to food systems, agency tends to relate to someone's capacity to make decisions, to take actions, and to influence their lives, but also the agricultural systems that they're a part of. And so improving women's agency in particular is crucial for advancing gender equality. The World Bank estimates that less than half of women in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia participate in decisions over their own health, major household purchases, and also visiting their family. And improving women's agency isn't just important intrinsically, it also has instrumental value. And it's been linked to positive impacts on household food security, nutrition, child development, and also agricultural productivity. Agency, as we heard from Jody, is also closely linked to processes of empowerment. It's essentially what enables people to transform the resources and assets that they have access to into well-being outcomes and to achieve their goals and aspirations. And at the same time, women's capacity to exercise their agency depends on the resources they have access to. And it's also important to note that gender and social relations and norms really shape this process and influence women's access and control of resources. Okay, next slide. So improving women's agency is clearly an important goal, but how do we go about measuring agency? For instance, how would we know whether an innovation increases women's agency or whether women with greater agency are able to benefit more from an innovation? And agency isn't something that we can directly observe. It's also quite complex and multifaceted. Great, next slide. And as part of an IFAD EU-funded project called Metrics, myself and colleagues have been conducting a large literature review looking at what metrics people are using to measure the performance of food systems. And this review has involved searching for articles looking at metrics that measure a range of different sustainability dimensions, including equity and agency. And this is just a quick summary showing the number of articles retrieved across these different dimensions. And you can see that we've got huge numbers of articles focused on metrics for measuring biophysical dimensions of food systems, productivity, soil health, water, but far fewer articles that look at the social dimensions, including agency. And this is just in the initial stages, but what I think it is suggesting is that we might have a potential lack of metrics for adequately measuring aspects such as agency. Okay, next slide. And if we take a closer look at these articles focused on agency, a few more insights emerge. And the first thing is that agency is most commonly measured using survey questions on decision-making. And we've already heard about women's empowerment in agricultural index. This is one that shows up a lot in the literature. Secondly, is that decision-making power is commonly measured by simply asking who is involved in a decision or has the final say. But understanding agency really requires more than just asking who makes the final decision. Next slide. We also need to understand how decisions are made and why decisions might be made jointly or by an individual. And these standard kind of surveys where you're asking who is involved in a decision, they overlook the complexity of decision-making processes and the extent to which someone may be able to or not influence a decision. And if you ask people to describe their involvement in joint decisions, perceptions can vary greatly, from just being in the room while a decision is made, or being able to actually negotiate and influence the outcome of a decision. So we need approaches and metrics that can also capture whether people's opinions are valued and taken on board, and the level of consultation. And more qualitative approaches, such as interviews, narratives, are likely to provide a much deeper understanding of these processes. But there are also some promising survey tools that are being developed. For example, the use of vignettes. And this is where you present respondents with a story depicting a range of different decision-making dynamics, and for each story asking them to evaluate to what extent that represents their reality. And so the advantages of vignettes is that you're able to communicate abstract concepts, but also tailor them to local contexts as well. Another aspect that is often overlooked when measuring agency is understanding whether someone's involvement in a decision is really driven by their own desires or by what's demanded or expected of them. And I think this is where we need to be very careful not to equate autonomy over a decision, so making a decision alone, with agency and empowerment. For example, some of our work in Kenya, we see that women with migrant husbands often have increased freedom and control over decisions, but this comes with increased stress, workloads, responsibility, and you hear about stories where women speak about the burden of making decisions alone. And this need to understand the kind of motives behind someone's interest in a decision also applies when people aren't involved in a decision. For example, we need to understand whether when women have a lack of interest in certain decisions, does that really reflect their preferences? Or is this more of a reflection of internal social norms and expectations? And again, qualitative approaches can be very helpful here, but there are more kind of quantitative metrics out there, especially around aspects such as motivational autonomy. But these have largely come from the field of psychology, and they often lack the validation and testing across a wide range of countries and contexts. Okay, so my take-home messages: measuring agency is critical for achieving equitable food systems, but it requires more than just asking who has the final say. We need to complement quantitative measures with qualitative approaches that help us to understand how and why people are involved in decisions, that take into account people's motivations and values, and that are also valid and context appropriate. And we're now going to hear from Gloria and Swati, who are going to talk about their experiences looking at agency in Ghana and India. So thank you very much.
Hello. So I'll start with for my slides. I'll introduce myself. I'm Gloria Adeiga from Ghana. I'm a PhD student at the Bangor University, and I'm going to share my experience of how we have used gender transformative approaches to sort of change women's agency in a case study in the northern parts of Ghana on a regreening project. Next slide, please. So I'll give a brief overview of the gender context in terms of restoration interventions, gender in terms of food security and restoration interventions. So cultural norms are what prescribe land control in the north of Ghana. It gives inheritance to men, and then by that virtue, men control the land, and then women have discretionary access, which is a problem because that discretionary access is then interpreted, and that depends on several factors. And we know that women, like my previous speakers have said, are very quite dependent on tree resources. And as a result of that, the interpretation is a challenge for their livelihoods. And tree products, if you consider that parts of the landscape is predominantly dry for most parts of the year, are very vital to meet the food demands that we have there. So having an access that is sort of mediated, it's a challenge for women. And how we have carried out restoration in practice is that it's usually deployed through these existing cultural structures where we are consulting with community leaders to decide what sites are prioritized for land restoration, tree preferences, and that is mostly just listening to the male perspective, and women often get excluded from these types of decisions. So if we are talking about agency and equity of land restoration outcomes, it's about time we start looking at these structural challenges and how we are going to overcome this for meeting our equity goals. Next slide, please. So how we have applied the GTA in this research is that we have used a collection of adapted tools to then provide a platform for men and women to have discussions about what the underlying factors of these gender equalities are, gender equalities in these gender norms are, of how then men and women input decisions, how resources are controlled and allocated, and then looking at the perceptions of women's role and contributions in the households and generally the aspirations we talk about, so that we can see a joint decision at the household level, which can then result in, I guess when I came here, I modified the slide, because if we then want to see that translated across the landscape, there should be a way that we can structurally engage them to then reflect both perspectives in the land use and land restoration outcomes. Next slide, please. So can you just, I don't want the animation. So the methodology composed of discussions that raised the awareness of both men and women of these gender norm, the inequalities, the perceptions, and also provided a reflection of how then these provide opportunities and constraints. And then the platform provided opportunities to discuss how they wanted to overcome this. So that was mostly done through the role plays. Then we had couples visioning their future together, households. Then we cultivated community champions that continued the discussion even when we were not present, physically present, and supporting the households to have these difficult discussions of how they were going to navigate what the challenges they were having at the household level. Then we went back and reviewed the process so that we could calibrate the process to, so it was a more iterative process, and we kept changing to suit what the changes were on the ground. And I would mention that one of the key outputs from the GTA process, next slide please, was then these gendered indicators of how the participants wanted to measure their progress. And it's a graduation from changes that they expected to see happen quickly, immediately after the interactions, the discussions, to changes that required more continuous action and engagement. And you see, I've highlighted some of them that are directly related to agency of women wanting to control income, input decisions, and men also committing to encourage women to leadership positions. I guess when I saw the indicators after we harmonized them, I was like, the men's indicators is also very reflective of what the women want. But I guess this is also an admission that there's an imbalance in favor of men and men willing to make concessions that improve the situation of women. Next slide, please. So this is an initial analysis of the where that we adapted to measure inputs in decisions. You'd see from the graph on the men's graph is that when it came to decisions, and specifically the power to make the decision of whether you wanted to sell the produce from the family farm, which is also very important because the family farm, it's also referred to as the man's farm, even though women and children contribute labor to the cultivation process. So you see that from the men's graph, there's not a change between the baseline and the end line within the control or the GTA communities. But when we go to the women's results, you begin to see that there are shifts towards a larger input into decisions about selling the crops, but then the shifts are larger within the GTA group. So there are other factors influencing this because you can clearly see that even in the control communities, these changes were happening. It just meant that there were several influencing factors, and our control was not exactly a control if you look at the locations of the communities. And whilst we were carrying out the intervention, the project was also scaling out through other activities like radio, and then through the small village saving groups. Last slide, please. So I guess we would also add our voice to the fact that context does really matter. And in this discussion, it's very important then to look at how the decision process affects the relations, because that was one thing that we realized, how the relationships shifts within the household to allow women then to contribute to the decisions are very important. Because even though we say gender norms are imbalanced in favor of men, what then does that mean for the man who holds the burden to make sure that his household is food secured or providing for his household? And now I've lost my train of thoughts. Okay, so we also see that even though we talk about things like access for women, what does that mean for men who have inherited land, but because there's an increase in longevity, they cannot access the land, and women are perceived to be transitory humans. They go to their husband's house, they come back, so they cannot carry the land with them. These are the types of discussions we should be having. And I guess the next steps then are then saying that the changes we have seen, yes, can happen, but what's the sustainability of that? We need to continue to engage them and then start to make the linkages between restoration and food security. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I know that I carry the burden of the last speaker, so I will be fast. Namaste to everyone, all my fellow scientists at Bogor, at Nairobi, and across the globe. From agroforestry, we are now shifting to agroecology, which I'm proud to say that CIFOR-ICRAF is leading the narrative in research and policy across the world. As you can see, the presenter here is the only person who is not a doctor, that is me. I'm one of the noob in science and research. I come from 10 years of operations and practice and a complete novice in research. So while I have community rigor, project and scale and systems rigor, I do not have the scientific rigor. It's been 6 months that I've been enrolled into a PhD program. And in the next 3 years, the 10,000 hours of my life will be to address this question of how do we measure women's agency in natural farming and agroecology in India. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the next 2-3 slides is just for you to give you a context. This is the country of India, the most populated country in the world right now. Obviously, we are at a very crucial juncture. What is happening in India right now is that there is a state of Andhra Pradesh where I've been working the last 7 years now. And here, there is a state which has demonstrated the scale of agroecology, that agroecology is scalable, natural farming can be taken to millions of farmers. So that is demonstrative state. We are in a post-pandemic world. So food systems are fractured and the COVID pandemic has shown us. So there is a eminent need for food systems. Transformation. And then there is third, that is, there is a shortage of fertilizers across the world because of the war and several reasons. So all of this, so India started at the precipice where the central government is talking about transformation. Several states are talking about transformation. There is a demonstrative state which has shown that it is possible. It can be taken forward. And then there is a good civil society movement also that is happening. I will not go into the nitty-gritties of natural farming because this is much for a larger discussion, because we want to come to why we are here today. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the framework of agroecology. We are in the entire scheme of things, the farmer and the APCNF program, that is the state government program, is at the center of it. And then all the major elements of agroecology have been, we are trying to address. We have gaps. There are a lot of gaps in the implementation, but the crucial element of it is that agroecology, majority in South Asia, especially in India perspective, is the mainstream green revolution methodology looks at it as a mythical or anecdotal in nature. So our scientific rigor is extremely strong. We are right now shifting towards a separate research institute, agroecology research institute, where we are talking about science of and research of agroecology. Here, the most important factor is that initially when we started the program, we started with men. Our problem was that the rate of transformation with men, farmer, was arithmetic in nature. Incidentally and fortunately for Andhra Pradesh, there has been a lot of social transformation that has happened in the last 2 decades because of the presence of women self-help groups and their federations. So what has happened is that the rate of transformation, when we started working with women, it went from arithmetic to geometric. And that is the scale that we are talking about, that with the same amount of energy, time, or the resources, we are able to reach to 10 to 15 women at a time as compared to men who cannot be quote unquote institutionalized, right? So that is a reason women are the pillar of transformation. Their federations are extremely seasoned. They are carrying the program in the villages, and that is where the systems approach came. How do we enable that? In spite of the program existence of one project, one program, how can we ensure that science and the practice and technology of agroecology reaches to the community and they carry forward the program? So can I have the next slide? So this is where we are. This is irrelevant. It is just to give you a snapshot of what exactly is happening in the program. We will talk about women in much detail. We are currently at 630,000 farmers, and we are present in 3,730 villages. Now here is where the difference between anecdotal and academia comes into picture. Next slide. So what we are talking about right now is the feminization of agriculture is there in India. Women are the actual tillers of the land, right? So they do the agriculture labor into the field. Now what happens is that in India especially, I'm sure my colleagues are here, the moment you talk about farmer, the image is of a man. And that is the biggest indicator of green revolution methodology has come into our mind. So what we are saying is that feminization of agriculture is there, and the hypothesis that feminization of agroecology is where we want to move. And there is a question mark. I've forgotten to put question marks everywhere. This is what we are trying to show in the next 3 years, 4 years, the aspirations of how women are going to lead the lead the movement of agroecology. And all of this is questioned. And the next 3 years is where I require your help. See, agroecology is interdisciplinary in nature, right? So along with this, what we are talking in agroecology TPP is how do we do research differently? Right now, the current tools and the measurement metrics that we have is not actually acknowledging the crucialities of agroecology and its transformation. So the 3 aspects that I will actually capture is that feminization of agriculture, where the equity of women, there is some, it is not a 0 and 1 scenario, that there is some equity agency of women that exists, and that agency is leading to further agency and it's feeding into each other. So there are 3 crucial matrices. That is of income, and income is with respect to different gradients. And then there is this aspect of care income that we want to measure. Now, this was very, the key speaker, Mr. Andrew Fanning, in this donut economy gave a very powerful message that care income, he mentioned it in the passing by, but we want to measure that not just a cash in hand. A woman having cash in hand is liberated. It's the first measure of liberation and index. But how do you actually ensure that the services that she provides with respect to dietary diversity, the food that is cooked, and the ecosystem services, the measurement of that, I require your help. Can you give us a tools? Do we have the parameters on which we can measure the care income of women to feed to the donut economy theory that Mr. Fanning talked about? Next slide, please. This is something which is extremely close to my heart because one of the biggest deterrent for agroecology and natural farming is that they're saying the propagators who are against agroecology say that it is labor intensive. Now, we want to do a research. I have a few of my colleagues who also have said the same thing, that their own practices have made them believe that agroecology practice is labor intensive. Can we measure it? Can we say which aspect of the entire value chain of agroecology is labor intensive? So we want to measure that. Yeah. And then what is the current accessibility to technology and input shock? And how can we also measure what is the scale of labor for women, especially because women are the one who are actually doing the, my God, it's such a burden. Why? All right. So also we are talking about shifting to year round. In Andhra Pradesh, you'll hear 365 days green cover. If you are talking about covering the soil with crops throughout the year, that the added burden is on women. So we need to, and this is where the critical thinking comes, that how much is the women going to face? And is it a good trade-off? Financial independence, is it a good trade-off for increased labor? So this is a question that we want to address. Next, and the last slide. Yeah, yes. Now the social status of women, it's very, so the decision-making aspect, this is where we need your help. Again, what is happening is that current tools and methodologies that are available, which helps in measures of empowerment of women, are talking about the outcomes, that the decision-making outcomes. But can we look at the processes where women are involved, where the decision-making becomes important? So we want to have those tools and matrices in the next 3 years that we would like to measure, that do they have empowerment or agency with respect to self? Do they have at the household level? Do women have at the farm level or at the village level? And second, last but not the least, we want to also look at the value chain. Right now, women are majorly in the production side of the value chain. But what is beyond farm gate is where
it is very crucial that the agency should be defined. It is happening. The point where I'm here is that while there is a program which is running from the last 6 years, we need to start measuring and making it more available to the world. Namaste and thank you.
Thank you so much, and apologies to all the speakers for rushing them. They all did a fantastic job sticking to time. I was told that we have an extra 5 minutes to add to questions. Please keep your questions very concise. I think we should give to Nairobi first. Please, Alice, can you collect 2 questions from the audience in Nairobi?
Yes, we have Ramni.
Really nice, excellent sessions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I just have a question for Jody or anyone else who wishes to respond. Where does biofortification fit into your discussions and your thoughts within the forestry, agroforestry landscape, and considering that we are trying to promote diversification through tree interventions and forest interventions? So just your thought on that. I have mine, but I'd love to hear yours. Thank you.
Alice, do you want to take one more question?
Yeah, can we take another question, please?
Hi, great presentations, very interesting. So I guess this goes for Jody in particular. You had a lot of recommendations that they seem very comprehensive. So I'm just trying to think of, if you had to pick 1 or 2 levers that would really shift things, what would those be?
Awesome. Jody, it seems like both questions are directed to you.
I shall attempt to give my thoughts. I don't know if there'll be comprehensive answers. Biofortification is not something I've thought about much in the context of equity, actually, or agency. It's part of our package of potential interventions. It's part of, what's out there in the world, but I think it's probably been given a bit more focus than it deserves in terms of all of the other options that are out there. There was a question online, there's been a bit of chat online that, sorry, the people in the room can't see. And one of the points there was, what's does the HLPE report address food sovereignty, which is kind of another tool in our package of potential interventions, right? And my answer there was that we talk briefly about food sovereignty in the report as a potential approach to equitable food security and nutrition, because it's an approach that tends to be slightly better at acknowledging and responding to those different aspects of equity, because it's an approach that tries to cover the system. It's an approach with people at its core, it's, even with right to food at its core. So it kind of ticks more of those recognition, representation, redistribution boxes of equity than some other approaches. If I were to apply that same thinking to biofortification, I haven't done that systematically, so these are just initial thoughts, but I can't see that biofortification has quite the same scope to address those, although I know it was created with a view of working specifically for some of the more marginalized rural groups in the world. So yeah, I think that would require a bit more thought, how biofortification and equity interact. I don't know if there's literature on it, but I think thinking it through in terms of, how does it address those 3 aspects of equity will probably give us an answer. So sorry, that's only a partial answer, but it requires all of us to do a bit more thinking. I'd love to hear, you said you had thoughts, I'd love to hear them. In terms of levers, in terms of the sort of recommendations that we have multiple different kind of recommendations, and I think the issue is that different levers are going to work better in different contexts, where both the sort of biophysical, agricultural, food systems context is different, but also the equity context is different, right? Different thing is going to work for poor communities in the north of England than will work for rural communities in West Papua, where I just came back from yesterday. So, so I think a lot of it is about thinking through those levers in practice, and again thinking through how does each of those potential levers work in context, and how does it address, you know, representation, recognition, and redistribution in terms of that context. What is it that needs to be addressed in that?
Thank you. And you just froze.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, but that's great. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn to the audience in Bogor and take 2 questions. Huria and Anya. So first, Huria. Sure. First, Doni wants to give his thoughts on the second question.
Sorry, I did not know your name, but the leverage on my presentation, it was the intervention maps. These food and land use system typologies that I presented could be the could provide evidence to foster productive discussions within the multidisciplinary or inclusive working group as an evidence for creating intervention maps. And also this method could pinpoint areas that could gain from non-location based actions, such as agricultural technology training and healthy balanced diet campaigns. So this could link landscape approach with evidence from household level studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Huria said no more, Mulia said no more questions, but I'm going to let Huria have one question. So
Paolo.
Just for equity, since Nairobi went, can we have Bogor one question?
So, okay, just maybe let me be very, very brief. I think I have to comment. The first one is about the first presentation and about the minorities. I think there is a need to understand a little bit more, or to characterize a little bit more when we talk about minorities, who they are. Are they in the city? Are they in the rural areas? Because, you know, being a minority doesn't mean that you are food insecure. It's the opposite, actually, that we can learn a lot from food systems, local food systems from some minority groups. And there are also evidence from West Africa. I don't know very well Vietnam, but West Africa, where it is clear, for instance, that pastoralist, Fulani pastoralist children are better off in terms of nutrition, even though they are minorities. So to understand also the networks around it. The second point is about, and I'm very happy that you mentioned that, Judy, in your last intervention, I think that we need to move a little bit from the food security to the food sovereignty framework, because, I mean, from the indigenous people's perspective, food sovereignty includes also the right to decide how this food was produced. It's just not to have enough food, but also to control that the food is sustainably produced and also culturally adapted. And also food security was used a lot as a paradigm to take over indigenous people territories in the name of the food security of the nations. So I think here it would be really interesting to hear from here if we want to take this approach in the future, or how we deal with this approach. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Huria. I'm going to turn it over to Nairobi, to Elian, to make some closing remarks.
So I would like to first thank the speakers. I think they articulated really clearly a lot of really dense, powerful information to help us understand the dynamics around this issue. It was very interesting to look at the poll around agency and how you know, and in some cases I was like, what are some people thinking in terms of the 5% of, you know, not having to think about agency in the work we're doing. I think at the end of the day, our work is about how are we empowering smallholder farmers and everybody around that last mile, indigenous people that depend on forest, local community, smallholder farmers. And so what is humbling, I think, for us as scientists is at the end of the day, it's how are we affecting mindsets, culture, behavioral change. And as much as we love our biophysical sciences, those are really critical elements that are going to help bring about the needed transformation and the needed changes in terms of power dynamics in ways where the losses that can come in terms of losses of power are replaced by improved sustainability, prosperity of communities by empowerment of women and marginalized community. And also the last remark was really critical around what can we learn from marginalized communities that are food secure and are working or living within their indigenous knowledge systems in ways that are allowing them to be food secure. And so obviously there's the threat of deforestation that can limit their capacity for food security, but how do we connect to that indigenous knowledge system intelligence and ensure that the work we're doing is building on that? And that as we're looking at the different dimensions of gender, how is the way we're treating gender issues and treating nature correlated and interacting in ways that are either helping us move forward in the directions we want or setting us back because we are overlooking some of these aspects that are critical, but that may not be as interesting for biophysical scientists around, well, we may not understand how to bring forward cultural change, but it's really critical to the work we do. So how do we ensure we're bringing all of those different dimensions of social change to ensure that the technological developments we can bring forward are accelerated and catalyzed by the capacity to look at culture, to look at these power dynamics, and how we can ensure that the work we're doing is bringing equity forward, knowing that there's going to be fear of loss, and that fear of loss will create resistances in the system, and that will create unintended consequences that may push things in directions we don't want. So how do we create greater awareness of those spaces we may not have the strongest expertise in, but we need to partner on to ensure that the work we do continues to have accelerated impact, especially in the next 7 years, as we look on taking our research to impact for the last mile. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to all of our speakers, and apologies for running over.